Welcome to another episode of TIDES. Today, we are diving deep into how AI is reshaping the way organizations approach corporate learning, especially when it comes to meeting employees where they are at in their moment of need. Joining me is Vince De Freitas, a thought leader in AI, product strategy, and corporate enablement. Vince brings a unique blend of experience from his time as an educator to his current role driving AI innovation at Docebo. He's passionate about leveraging AI to transform how employees learn and grow within their roles. Vince, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Shweta. Lovely to be here.
Vince, we are witnessing unprecedented changes in the work environment due to AI. Over the past 2 years, GenAI has not only entered the conversation around automation, but has also started to fundamentally transform how we work. Jobs and job roles are evolving rapidly, and there's virtually no area of business or workplace that will not be touched by AI in some way, including the critical function of learning and development. How do you see AI, and particularly Gen AI, reshaping the L&D function in an organization?
It's a big question. I think one of the first things I always want to acknowledge on this topic is that we've had AI playing a role in L&D for a fair amount of time already, right? And we can call this old AI, legacy AI, dumb AI, if you will. But it is that those machine learning algorithms and natural language processing systems that existed before OpenAI hit the market and kind of introduced us all to this new way of thinking. And so prior to Gen AI, we saw a lot of optimization and efficiency gain and things like AI voices, summarization techniques, things that ultimately helped you to build content faster or save time with processes that ultimately might be expensive and take a ton of time, like doing voiceovers or multilingual content. And so prior to Gen AI, we already had a bit of a history in learning and development using these systems to squeeze a little bit more out of a little bit less in some ways. But as we think about Gen AI, there's a lot of really crazy opportunities that we have. Content creation is obviously the big one that's in some ways low-hanging fruit. And so I anticipate quite a bit of disruption on the content creation side. How that's going to pan out is going to be largely informed by the standards we set and the kind of ideals that we hold dear to us as we build out content with AI systems. I think it'll get worse before it gets better. And what I mean by that is when I look at AI generated content as an expert in a number of domains that I use it for, I'm largely unimpressed. In a lot of ways, I find the writing to be quite average in some ways, but I'm always conscious that this is the worst that it's ever going to be. And the opportunity for improvement there is significant. And I think that that's where we're really going to see some cool opportunities pop up.
Great. And what do you see as macro challenges for L&D function that they have to be thinking about at this stage? We'll dive deeper into, specific roles within L&D, but I really wanted to hear your opinion on what's disrupting L&D. How should they be thinking about it?
Yeah, macro challenges for L&D. A lot of this is going to bleed through from an organization's overall take on their L&D function, right? In a lot of businesses, L&D is kind of this necessary evil. It's a cost center, and it's seen as just this compliance machine that keeps you from getting sued. I think the opportunities that those organizations have with L&D and AI are going to be perhaps a little bit more limited than an organization whose culture around learning is one where learning is truly a force multiplier for the employees, the team, and the business, and it's a strategic player. Now, leadership in L&D organizations all around the world can play a role in redefining this relationship with the organization. But I think when we think about AI for learning and development, you can probably, in simple terms, break it into two. There's going to be the utilization of AI in L&D to achieve L&D objectives. And then there's going to be the inevitable role that learning and development plays in implementing and supporting AI for other teams, because as much as we're here to talk about learning and development, there's AI for marketing, AI for sales, AI for finance, AI for spreadsheets. And so, L&D has always been that change agent within businesses to help implement new processes, tools, and strategies like that. And so I think there's going to be kind of two roles to play here, understanding the impact for our own teams, and then how do we function as a change management organization to help facilitate growth in other parts of the business. It's going to come down to team structures in areas where you're expecting AI to write stuff for you. Accuracy and trust, I always say, is one of the biggest components. And so future AI systems and some of the current AI systems will leverage your knowledge to generate content. But then I ask the question, is your knowledge clean? Do you have great knowledge management practices, or do you not really even trust your own stuff to feed it into a system? And then as soon as I say feed information into an AI system, my privacy brain lights up, and I'm sure that there's like a chief information officer that's cringing at the idea of uploading your documents into a large language model. So a lot of big things from organizational structure to knowledge management that typically come front to mind when I think about macro factors for AI.
Yeah, sounds like this might be an opportunity window for L&D to rethink how they support the rest of the organization, because in most organization L&D and knowledge management sits in two different silos.
Yeah.
There's so much information that exists in organization which can support the learning and development function differently, but it can't today because information is spread in multiple sources, sitting in multiple places. And to
It's
your point,
everywhere.
sometimes it's not valid, vetted, and clean information to be leveraged as well.
And even worse, it's valid and clean for a minute of time, right? Because it's often like you see those informal messages in Teams and in Slacks where information is getting shared in real time, and it might be true in March of 2024, but by September, process has changed, and so you have often knowledge sharing in really organic ways, which is fantastic. But it's also quickly dated and often not maintained at all. So where do you draw the line in which information systems you tap into? I don't think we have a good answer yet.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if for a second we put the learner hat on, you and I both have been learners and we're learning constantly. And if we put ourselves in an organizational context, from a learner's perspective, what do you see as the biggest challenges in the learning experience today that potentially AI can help solve for? Whether it can today or not, we will get into that discussion. But are there possibilities in the learning experience that you think are going to be solved for with AI in the mix?
Short answer, yes, but this is such a double-edged sword in a lot of ways. In my career, I've done everything from classroom teaching to curriculum development, higher education, and corporate learning. So every kind of stage, whether you're a kid, a teen, a young adult, or like a seasoned professional, I've played a role in learning. And I think one of the constant challenges we see in learning is motivation, curiosity, and in some ways even figuring where to get started, right? And so when I look at a lot of these AI systems and these large language models and chatbots, I see the world's knowledge compartmentalized into a search box. It feels very much like starting with a blank page and hitting that analysis paralysis of like, what do I even do here? Right? So I think we've in some ways solved a supply issue by now putting all of the knowledge into a simple interface. But if we don't really have intention around where do we want to get started, which is a problem statement, it loses its momentum, right? And so the folks I speak to in the K-12 world in my network are telling me that kids don't even know how to ask questions. And funny enough, that's not even that different from a lot of the adults I see working with tools like this. You can use ChatGPT, Gemini, or any of these models for anything from marketing to SEO to learning content. I don't think we're seeing utilization at the rate that we would expect because it's almost so powerful, it's paralyzing on where to get started, right? So learners are going to need a lot of support and structure on where to get started with these things. The other thing I start to think about then a lot is trust, because in my experience, learners will take the path of least resistance, right? Humans will take the path of least resistance. And what I sometimes wonder how we're going to figure out is I think something like AI can often offer a simple answer to a sometimes complex problem. And learners, in my experience, are happy to take that because it's an easy win and then move on. But I think that there's some nuance that happens in learning that when you have just a little assistant that gives you a short and sweet answer, it doesn't necessarily motivate or encourage deeper understanding. And so I think that's still the role of humans as architects of learning experiences, to recognize AI as a part of the toolkit, but not a replacement for a whole knowledge system or a curriculum architecture that starts learners with the basics, but then does encourage and promote them to move into some intermediate concepts and eventually mastery. That's going to look different for every kind of thing you're learning for. But I think learners may not always choose the most effective decisions for learning when given full agency. And so some balance between practitioner, facilitator, curriculum designer, and learner experience needs to be in place to ensure that people don't just get satisfied with a quick answer from a chatbot and move on without giving it scrutiny and critical thinking that learning deserves.
Absolutely. And it also, I think, depends on the moment of need for a learner.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're going through an onboarding experience, structure definitely makes sense. Or you're in a manufacturing setting where there is compliance involved, structure makes sense. But at the same time, when you're in an, let's say, professional services organization,
Yep.
and you've never built a pivot table, but suddenly there's a need for you to build a pivot table.
Yeah.
My pet peeve with learning experiences of today has been that I want to know how to create a pivot table, but when I search it up, one,
Yeah.
my search list is like 100 links that I have to filter through.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big pain point. The other pain point is that it directs me or to a course on Excel. I don't need the course on Excel. I need an answer to how do I create a pivot table. So in when I was leading an L&D function, our biggest competitor was Google at the time because
Totally.
people will not want to go to a box to search and filter and service their needs. They would rather go to Google. So that was our competitor at that time.
Yeah, I love that too, because I think if anything, one of the biggest opportunities for AI is for us to build branching multimodal learning experiences that recognize learners where they are and what they need, right? And so what I mean by that is I talk a lot and I think a lot about universal design for learning. I'm not a big fan of learning styles. I don't think many people are these days, but UDL, universal design for learning, is all about multiple modes of representation, multiple modes of interaction and expression. And so to your point, right, like a RISE course for everything or an e-learning course for everything, when I've led instructional design teams, I always reminded people, like, if all you have is e-learning creation software of your choice, everything is going to look like a course. And job aids and the experience of a worker sometimes requires that just-in-time fact sheet. Sometimes it's as simple as a checklist. And that's enough to get somebody on track quickly and to keep them focused. So I appreciate everything you said there about the pivot tables and Google, but I also recognize that we've seen this before. Google didn't eradicate the need for schools, didn't eradicate the need for L&D in the same way. I don't think AI is going to take this down. It's too important of a function.
Yeah, yeah. I hear you and I agree with you. And this is where I would love to hear your perspective on this framework that most of us who come from L&D world would have crossed paths with, the 70-20-10 framework for learning. I think it's like a strategy tool that helps us
Yep.
understand how do we balance experiential learning with social learning with structured learning, where 70% of learning is happening in the flow of work, where we are put in a situation where we have to do something new or improve what we are already doing. And of course, social is peer to peer, and 10% is going through e-learning courses, workshops, and other modalities of learning. And it was really hard to strike this balance in organizations. Mm-hmm. That's why we saw most of the organizations invested in 10%, because that's where we had the most control. That's where we could have metrics that showed us or indicated, are people consuming the learning or not? What kind of courses people are taking, so that we could refine our decisions. But with AI in the mix, do you think it helps us bring 70-20-10 to life in modern work context? And should organizations be thinking about 70-20-10? Is it still relevant in the times we are living in today?
Start at the end of the question there on, like, should organizations be thinking about 70-20-10? I think, like, yes, with an asterisk on it, in the sense that I like frameworks from a convenience standpoint, but I think that a book of frameworks doesn't necessarily make you a master practitioner. It's experience, it's thoughtfulness, and understanding really, like, what's the point of that framework, right? Like, I think when I abstract away from the 70, the 20, and the 10, really the core message of that is, hey, learning requires both formal and informal, period. Like, that's really what I take away from that. And I think that that is an underlying truth that can withstand crazy changes in environment, right? Because I think we had a ton of frameworks for learning, but then a pandemic happened and we were all caught off guard, and quickly we reached for our frameworks and realized that they weren't really built in a world where a crazy disruption like a pandemic happened. And we didn't know what to do, and we scrambled and we made up plans and we spent money on tools that we maybe didn't keep. And so that's where I worry for frameworks sometimes, when you don't really understand the underlying point. If we think about something like the 70-20-10 as a reminder that learners require and succeed most when there's a balance between a sufficient amount of formal and informal learning, I think there's a lot of wins there. There's also a lot of risk because, I've seen it referred to as like the beige wave of content, where now that we can create tons of content really quickly with AI, we're going to flood that. And there is a supply and demand balance that exists for something like content, where suddenly if you have too much of something, people just lose interest. And if people lose interest in that formal content, which is still, even if it's just the 10 part of 70-20-10, it's still a vital and important part. We might lower the content quality, which then hurts engagement at a really key stage where we want to introduce foundational skills and fundamentals in traditional e-learning, so that by the time you actually work with a human being and you start doing the social part of it, you actually know what you're talking about. Because we've all worked with people who want to jump right into like maybe the intermediate or the expert level of the content, and you're like, take a couple steps back maybe, and like, let's get some good foundational skills in there. So I think something like 70-20-10 is going to be valuable in a way as we move forward thinking about L&D and learning, but I think it's more important to understand why something like that has existed for as long as it has, the core value for learning that it represents, and then how do you take that core value and adapt it repeatedly as the world around us changes and transforms. And AI is going to be one of those forces that, is it still social learning when it's with an AI chatbot? I don't know the answer to that, but that would technically be AI sliding into the 70 of that heuristic, right? It's going to come down to how a learner feels about it. And right now, I'm unimpressed by AI video. The uncanny valley hasn't quite been jumped across yet, or if it has, it's been done so well that I didn't know I was looking at AI video, which is a different problem. So I think it's still relevant, but there's a lot of nuance there to how we interpret that over the next coming years.
I really like that perspective of yours that 70-20-10 is a framework, but it has to be contextualized again to the needs of the learner and where they sit in the learning journey and what moment of learning they're trying to solve for. Because if somebody is very new to applying a particular skill set in their job, maybe that 10% is the 70% because they need to go through a structured environment. But
Absolutely.
If you bring a leader into the mix, then maybe it has to be experiential because now they want to apply all the concepts, the theories and frameworks that they've learned over a period of time. Love that.
It's how you drive intention really behind those things, even social, right? Like, to me, I can form social relationships on the internet. For some people, they think social needs to be face-to-face, but we had pen pals once upon a time that we never met. I grew up playing video games with strangers on the internet and they felt like real friends. So I think the definitions of these words are quite loaded, and being thoughtful about how you apply it and what it means for learning is going to be key.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So I'm hearing that you're not particularly impressed with the output that is generated from a content perspective from AI. Totally agree. AI is still not perfect. And like you said, it's the least sophisticated version of AI that we are seeing today. But how about if we shift our perspective to behind the scenes work that people have to do to bring a learning experience to life? Do you think AI is changing the game when it comes to producing learning experiences? And if so, how?
I think yes, in two big ways. There's a lot of the not sexy, attractive work that goes into a program, like metadata management and like skills mapping and things like that. That is such an easy lift for AI we look at how large language models can understand language, so to speak, and create connections and map things out. So I think there's a lot of toil that goes into administering a program that AI can absolutely flatten, and it's fantastic and it saves a ton of hours, but it's not as catchy as like watching an entire short story appear in real time, right? And so I think sometimes we lose sight of those innovations because they don't market quite as well as the big flashy build a course in 5 seconds. Its accessibility is number 2. When I think about global learners, when I think about in L&D, there's always this equation you've got to balance between cost to build something and size of audience it's impacted. I see small audiences often hurt by budgetary decisions around like, can we really afford to do translation here? Can we really afford to get a voiceover in here? And so I think that is going to be one of the bigger behind the scenes transformations, is the ability to service audiences really cheaply that otherwise it's hard to build a business case around. Like, hey, let's get this translated into 76 languages. Let's make sure that, we've got it in a short, concise version for like a little bit of micro learning while still satisfying the need for something a bit more robust. And so to me, that's a little bit more behind the scenes. It's a little bit more tactical, but I think that the impact you can make with something like that is huge.
Yeah. So, I mean, in a way, what we're hearing that AI is going to impact jobs is the example that you gave is true, because now I can't see an organization with like 11 labs in play going to a recording studio to get audio recorded. Like,
yeah.
those audio artists will have to now rethink about, I have these set of core skills. Now, what do I do with them to make myself relevant as the workflow of producing a learning experience has changed? Art, graphics design, that world has shifted dramatically. Now, maybe an instructional designer can do the work of image generation, or an organization doesn't have to invest in stock images and whatnot, because you can create unique images on the fly depending on what you need.
Yeah, I think transformation is the word that comes here a lot, because I always like to think of it as like we're changing the shape of one thing into the shape of another, as opposed to reducing a part of the whole entirely, right? I think we're going to see a greater, let's say, creator economy, if you will, in a fully implemented world of AI. I think a lot about a buddy of mine in Chicago. He works in theater. He essentially leads the entire theater project down there. And he reached out a few weeks ago to say, like, hey, just to the boys group, like, hey, a bunch of you are clever on this AI stuff. I've got a thing I'm doing. Let's have a chat. And we did a little bit of back and forth around like tooling, is there some problems he wanted to solve. And ultimately, he needed to design a set, and he needed to work with a designer all the same, but he felt really unprepared on how to articulate the vision in his head to this designer, right? And he was able to use a couple of the popular image generation tools in plain language to actually start to formulate what his vision looked like in a way that he could translate then with a designer. That designer could work faster. It would be a fewer number of hours ultimately on the project, but that lets my buddy, who's running the entire show, spend those hours and that money in another part of the project to make it better as a whole, right? So in that way, I don't see necessarily the full removal of a designer in that way, but I see a transformation of what the creative director, my buddy, has been able to accomplish vis-a-vis AI, a shift in how the designers brought in, but still that budget gets spent on other parts of the production to make it bigger. And so when I abstract this out to an organization and I think about the various roles that various teams play as we work together, I see perhaps the hours and the intentionality shifting from some parts which were really, really dense and expensive to other parts, because now everyone can play a larger role in solving the problem than they previously could, because they were blocked by something that now AI can unblock.
Yeah. So true. And one of the other challenges that came to my mind as we were talking this through was personalization. Our technology wasn't able to deliver learning experiences personalized to the learners. How do you feel that world changing with Gen AI and other forms of AI in the mix?
When we get fully ramped into this, it's going to be really, really powerful stuff. There's a significant amount of work to do to get there on kind of all fronts, like even the idea of personalization, right? I think I've seen some really incredible demos from OpenAI and others of like, hey, take this big complex problem and explain it to me in the terms of basketball, right? And it takes like a physics equation and says, well, force needs to be applied to the ball. And when a professional, and it was really cool and novel, but that's a use case and an idea that I don't think most people would think to start using AI in this way. And so, once upon a time, there was a website that was called, let me Google that for you. And you could just use it as a fun way to remind friends that, hey, you don't have to ask me, you can Google things. I think we now need to consider how we're going to develop that muscle that we have for Google, but with AI, because I think one of the habits we can probably build is, instead of maybe Googling, going to one of these large language models and working there instead, because, worst case scenario, it's not going to work out. Maybe you've asked something that's out of its capabilities, that's fine. But maybe it saves you 30% of time, or maybe it saves you 90% of time. But if you build that muscle and that habit to get into it every single week, you're going to keep track of how the technology itself is progressing. And so constant interaction is going to be a really big part of that personalization, because within reason, you can train the models to understand a little bit about you, right? Like when I work with mine, it knows where I work. It knows what role I'm at. It knows the projects we've worked on previously. And so it really is through that repetition, spaced or intentional, that you're going to be able to build those habits and better understand what you want to get out of it so that you can have a more personalized experience.
This is fantastic, because I don't know if you've had an experience with Notebook LM, but my daughter the other day, she's in grade 12, and she wanted me to explain a philosophy concept to her. So I uploaded her content on Notebook LM, and she and I interacted in real time once that podcast was generated. And it was like the output that she got was far better than I would have been able to explain that huge philosophical concept to her. It even came up with examples and anecdotes for her to kind of make that concept, which is very abstract, highly philosophical, to make it relevant to a 12th grader. So I think,
Yeah.
to your point, it's about playing. It's about leveraging the tool landscape that we have at our disposal and see what works for us when and how do we want to use it. So on that note, which tools are you using on a regular or frequent basis, just as a curious person, as an AI enthusiast?
I am actually just mostly sticking with just the base LLMs. So I've got Anthropic that I have access to. I've got GPT I've got access to, and I've got Gemini as well. It is January 28th right now. So DeepSeek just came out earlier last week, and it's obviously the one that we're all paying attention to for all of the reasons you see in the news. Inference time as well is really powerful. But I'm not quite at the stage where I'm using tools that leverage AI. I still like working directly with a large language model, right? Because I've already built that habit now where I task redirect from reaching for Google to reaching for ChatGPT. Because right now I don't want to split my attention too widely, because right now I've got a bit of context with OpenAI software, so I want to keep building on that. And they tend to release capabilities more often than not. But every so often I do try to open up all 3 or 4 and then throw the same prompt at a number of them just to kind of see how the performance and the nuance changes across the model. So I still like working directly with like an OpenAI or a large language model. I ask it anything from like, what cut of beef is this that I just found in the freezer, using the multimodal visual stuff, to, I'm working on a big project called this. Here is the brief that I've got to fill out, reference it for all of the different H1s and H2s, and then just fill it out for me. And then I always need to rework it. Again, this is where I find myself not quite impressed with it to just automate and go. But I'm a human being with agency, and an adult that knows to check it and not just accept it at face value. And that's why I always tell people, like, don't trust it too much. It's sometimes an easy answer to a complicated problem.
Yeah. And do you see that as you're using it in your personal and professional lives, the time it takes to complete a task has gone down significantly? Because that's my personal experience. To your point, the output in the first go might not be perfect, but it gives you an opportunity to iterate on that question much faster than in any other way. And it's reduced the time to the output significantly.
Yeah, and I've definitely found that those returns have become realer the longer I've spent with it, right? Like the first week or 3 of using one of these things is mostly experimentation. Like, what can I do? And that's where you start to establish those boundaries of I'm not going to really trust it with anything mathematical right now in the limited ways I use mathematics in my day to day, because I don't really love the output there. And I also can't check it well enough to trust that it's right. But for various projects and tasks like that, yeah, it's a fantastic brainstorming partner. I think when we talk about creativity, it's an unlocker of creativity. But there's a famous saying about Henry Ford, right? Like, if he had asked customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. I like to joke that if Henry Ford had a large language model, it also would have suggested a faster horse, because I think it's good at creating things that are new to you. But that's only because we as humans have only seen so much, right? So I think there's novelty there, but true creativity and innovation is something that's never existed before. Right now, I still think humans have an edge on that. And so I like it as a way to unblock my creative work when I feel stuck. But if anything, it makes me feel more creative rather than less.
Amazing. And have you seen in your professional life examples from people who you've crossed paths with, leaders who you've crossed paths with, organizations that you've crossed paths with, who have started to use AI in creative ways, specifically in the learning and development space, or even broadly?
Yeah, I've seen bits and bobs around the place. Notably, at a recent customer conference we held at work, we brought folks from Airtable up to talk about how they've used AI to really, really redesign how they think about their customer education program. And so there's really cool opportunities across L&D, regardless of if you're doing external learning programs for customers or partners, or internal programs for your own team, to build content out faster. But a program, if you've run one or built one, requires a lot of steps. And so even just like the project management of it all, the ideation around like different strategies and approaches to take, you'll get like B minus work out of AI sometimes, but then you as a professional get to take that B, work it and refine it into an A, and it's going to take you way less time than if you started from scratch. And so we're still largely seeing big gains on content creation optimization. But as we look at the evolution of these technologies, particularly around things like voice and face creation and generation, I think we're going to start to see that the use cases expand beyond just like traditional e-learning content to more experiential experiences.
And will that impact the current learning technology stacks that the organizations have?
I'd hope so. I mean, technology always brings progress in some way, shape, or form. And so I think businesses are pretty, obsessed with progress and building and, innovating in new ways. And so I think everybody's looking at their tech stack right now and trying to make a good sense of where do I spend my dollars? Where do I make investments? I'm also anticipating a fair number of 1-year contracts and 2-year contracts because people want to feel free to try things out for a little bit because this is a space that's changing so rapidly. So I think there's going to be a lot of growth and a lot of churn on a lot of these tools as people suss out, what's real or what's kind of a simple tool wrapped around a more powerful tool and underlying technology that won't really last for 10 years.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an incredibly insightful conversation, Vince. And as we wrap up, what advice or what tips would you give to leaders who are just beginning to explore AI-driven learning solutions, be it front-end solutions or back-end, to produce learning experiences? And how can they best prepare their organization to not just adopt these technologies, but also to adapt their learning strategies to meet the evolving demands of the future workforce?
Yeah, there's a lot in there. I think the starting spot is to be curious and stay curious, right? Like I like to equate where we are now to like the AOL dial-up days of the internet, right? Like who logging into the internet and dial-up could have ever imagined a world where like CEO analyst was a career or like senior cloud architect was a career? Like we are in such an early stage of what this all might look like that in a lot of ways, nobody can really guess what 20 years out is going to look like, right? But at the same time, there's an underlying recognition that this is really the start of something that's very long. And so there's excitement, there's enthusiasm, but there's also a real risk of burning out because as somebody whose day job requires me to stay focused on these topics, it's a lot, right? And it's okay to take a step away and take a break because you just need to. But one of the people that I love listening to speak about AI in education is Sal Khan from Khan Academy. And he did a talk recently where he said something to the effect of, this cat's out of the bag for better or worse. And you're either going to look away and take your hands off the wheel, but then somebody else is going to stay focused and they're going to keep their hands on the wheel and they are going to drive the direction of this. Mm-hmm. And, that's why I say if you need to take a break, it's fine to take a break from this stuff, but you still need to figure out what works for you insofar as staying curious, staying motivated, and paying attention to this because it will transform and evolve. And right now, the clay is soft. This is where we all, as professionals in learning and development, have an opportunity to be heard and to make statements about what we expect from this and how we want this to go. Because learning will never disappear in any way, shape, or form. It is an industry that will persist as long as we do because we love to grow. And so whether it's going to be over the internet or television or now with AI, like innovation comes and goes all the time. At the end of the day, what's stuck around in my experience is that best practices and foundational principles of how people learn come first and foremost, and the tools should reach to meet those expectations as opposed to us redefining our craft, which we know very well, and we have tons of evidence and research around how learning is effective in all environments. I think we need to keep those central and use those to influence and drive the development of AI tools because they're going to develop. And it's our opportunity and our job right now to stay involved and stay aware of what that means so that we can be positive change agents in how these technologies come together.
Beautifully said. I completely hear your words and what I imagined as you were explaining and wrapping up your final thoughts. Lifelong learning stood out to me as I was envisioning it. So thank you, Vince, for sharing your insights and expertise today. It's been an incredible conversation about how AI is revolutionizing corporate learning, from addressing the challenges of 70-20-10 to delving in just-in-time learning solutions.
Thanks for having me. Love talking about it.
And for our listeners, if you're inspired by today's discussion, don't forget to subscribe and share. And until next time, keep innovating and reimagining the future of work.